Good evening, everyone. Hello, and yes, we're back on the fibre. Although I still have to get in touch with them because the speed's well down, but at least it is stable, or it has been stable anyway. Fingers crossed. So what I'm going to discuss today is every now and then, people will ask, "Oh, how can you be so sure that the Tories are going to lose the election and Labour can't be complacent?" No, Labour can't be complacent, but I can be sure because I'm not part of their strategy. But there were several reasons just in this last week. I've been going over all sorts of reasons because what people do, and this includes the Labour leadership, I know that the Labour leadership themselves fear this repeat of 1992. But the current situation is nothing like it. Em's asking there, wasn't born at the time, what happened? What happened was that the Conservatives won the general election and people felt that Labour were going to win it. Now, what actually happened was the polling had sort of got a few things wrong. Remember, polling then worked very differently now. I mean, pollsters learnt lessons and so on. But even then, if you look back at the polling, if I can show you some of this. I'm just going to get rid of this. This is more recent Ipsos polling. Which one am I looking at? So if we look here, for example, so this is the this is the polling from 1991, should we say, first of all, because the year before the general election, just like we're into now. You know, Labour lead, negative, negative, zero, negative, positive, 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 negative, zero. So it upped and down towards the end of 1991. It was positive, but not like by 20 points, like 6 points. And the other thing to remember here as well, there weren't lots of other parties involved. You had Labour, you had the Conservatives, you had the Liberal Democrats, who were still sort of really growing at that point. That was really it. There was every other party was tiny, didn't even have anything of the equivalent of the Green Party. Even like the SNP implied were really small. Then into 1992, again, negative, positive, positive, negative. You know, it seesawed. It's just that there was this little run of Labour maintaining a lead, but you can see the size of the lead. It's tiny. March the 30th was +7. That's the bare minimum they needed, the bare minimum. But obviously the election wasn't in April, it was in May. Again, the Tories took the lead again. Labour, you know, so it was even forewarning of it. You know, as we got up to the general election, the Tories just took the lead. You know, the last time that Labour had a lead was a month before the general election, and it was like a +1. Now, obviously, we have to point out that with first past the post, a poll lead, like a voting intention lead, doesn't automatically mean you're going to win the election, because you can, in theory, win more seats than your opponent with fewer votes. But by and large, it doesn't generally. It generally works out that the one with the most votes will also get the most seats, because they'll also have a strategy that tries to focus those votes anyway. But yeah, so whereas now we've got a situation, if I get rid of this and I put up, this is the last 20 years of Ipsos. This is Ipsos Mori polling. Now, whenever I talk about pollsters, I always say YouGov and Ipsos Mori in the last few years have been very, very good. They're my pick. They're the two for me that are my picks. And you know, Labour, of course, are the highest they've been in this 20 years. But more importantly, in fact, you know, you look at it, Labour have a higher poll lead now than they did and you can't see it too much detail, I'm afraid, because it's quite small. But this goes back to 2003. So, like, in fact, the general election's marked for you there on the left-hand side. That's the 2005 general election where Labour won. The last time Labour won. Labour's poll lead at the moment, way higher than that. It is the high. Obviously, it's not higher than under the Truss lettuce wars, but in terms of, like, you know, without the Conservatives appointing a certified lunatic, it's the highest it's been for 20 years. And it's consistently above it. In 1991 and 1992, they seesawed between each other. And then, as someone's saying, John's saying there, Neil Kinnock in a recent interview admitted He knew the 1992 general election was lost in the first week. Yeah, I remember that interview. The way he described it is he described himself as Marmite. For those who don't know, it's like the classic thing, either you love it or you hate it. I happen to love it. In fact, I have chili Marmites, even better. But but that's what he said. Like, and he's right as well. He was right. It was known at the time that it was like Neil Kinnock was perfectly capable. He was perfectly competent, but he just had that personality that endeared him to some people, but put off others. You know, I often sort of describe people like Emily Thornberry and Angela Rayner being quite similar, in that the people they appeal to really think they're brilliant, but the people that are put off to them really hate them. It's like, you know, it's like that Marmite thing. And he described John Major as marmalade. The other thing that happened in 1992, so the reason why so many people were sort of thinking this will be it for Labour was because, first of all, the Tories have been in power for quite a long time. Margaret Thatcher was stunningly unpopular. Right? That's it. She'd blown it at this point. She'd basically done what Boris Johnson had done, only obviously in her case, not as egregiously. She hadn't had, broken the law or anything. But she had blown it with the public. She was not going to win another election. But the Tories got rid of her. And they got John Major. Whereas you could look at this and you could go, well, they got rid of Boris Johnson. It's like, yeah, but they didn't replace him with someone credible. Like John Major was credible. He was credible. Rishi Sunak ain't got a clue. No idea. Absolutely no idea what he's doing. So I'll before I go through some more comments, I'll just go through quickly and then we can go in more detail if you like as well. Just this week alone, what the Conservatives have been doing I need to compile a list. Do you know what? I'm going to compile a list of all the reasons why the Tories, in order for the Tories to win the next election, it's not that it's impossible. It's that one of three things has to happen, or some combination of them. One, Labour have to have a proper meltdown, right? Because at the moment, you'll see plenty of articles saying, Labour need to do this. I saw there was an article, I haven't read it yet, but I've seen the title of it. Starmer could learn from this in how to be bold. And it's like, well, why do you want him to be bold? Bold means losing the election, you idiot. You know, it's like the number of people who are saying Labour needs to do this completely different thing if it wants to win the election. It's like, are you off your head? They're winning the election. If there was an election tomorrow, they would win it handsomely. If there's an election next year, they will win it handsomely. They've not only got a more stable strategy, they've not only got a united parliamentary party, they're now bringing in more donations, for goodness sake. They've got a bigger war chest for the general election. You know, everything's going Labour's way. Why on earth? Like, what they really mean is Labour are doing things they don't like. Well, they're doing things I don't like, but I also understand they're doing it strategically. I also accept some of the things they're doing, they may be excessively cautious. I accept that, but I'd rather that than reckless. So basically, Labour could have a meltdown, and that is possible because remember, Keir Starmer, I'm quite sure, has his eyes on the prize, but he's not king of Labour. You know, he can't ignore the party. He can't ignore his MPs. If his MPs lost their nerve or if members lost their nerve, then, you know, it can still come falling down. But I see Labour MPs focused, and I see Labour Party members focused, right? They accept the pragmatic side of winning. The second thing that can happen is the Conservatives could actually start listening to voters and acting on it. They're showing no signs of doing that. They're now going full Lee Anderson on the culture wars. That, you know, so that's not going to happen. The third thing is some incredibly bizarre situation occurring that suddenly rallies people around the Conservatives, like being invaded by France or something. But I don't see that happening either. So, I mean, this is what I say. But this week alone, what have the Conservatives been doing to convince me that they are not a credible party, that they're not going to win the next election? Greg Hands, party chair, is an idiot. He was boasting. Let me get it up again. Oh, no, I've lost it. Hold on. He was boasting. I will need to read the tweet out. I should have actually clipped it so I could show you it, but I'll just read it out. It's good enough. So Greg Hands, he says, He was in Huddersfield this week. He said, final stop on my West Yorkshire campaign trail is Labour-held Huddersfield. He's posing in front of a statue of Harold Wilson. You know, apart from Tony Blair, the most electorally successful Labour leader. And then he said, we got Labour's majority down to below 5,000 in 2019, and it would be great to win the constituency of Harold Wilson. It's like, you're not going to win new seats. The Conservatives can't have a strategy. He's in charge of their campaign strategy. When the general election comes round, it's not him. Isaac Levidow, a proper strategist, is in charge of their general election campaign. But everything they're doing now to campaign, he's in charge of. And he's giving the impression that they're actually trying to win seats that they couldn't win in 2019. Any seats they couldn't win in 2019, they're not winning. They're not winning them. Their only route to power after the next election is to retain as many of the seats they did win as possible. They should not even be thinking about any other seats. Second reason, the school buildings collapse scandal, which is now, you know, expanding into other things as well. Like, if Labour can't capitalise on that, then I don't even know. Like Bridget Phillipson, someone said earlier that Labour are planning a shadow cabinet reshuffle, so she may not be the one carrying it forward. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's imminent. It could be, I suppose. I'm not sure that if I were Starmer, I would have an imminent reshuffle. I don't know. There's pros and cons. Part of me would think I'd want it to be reactive. You know, wait for Sunak to do his reshuffle, because and then get the sort of personalities that can needle their opposite numbers. But who knows? But basically, this scandal is massive and Labour should be all over it. Now, in a way, because it's now been expanded to courts and hospitals, you could argue it's not entirely down to Bridget Phillipson, who's Labour's shadow education secretary. Wes Streeting can get on the act as well. But Labour collectively needs to really make a massive deal of this. The other thing is, you know, you're reading the news about this. We know, and I've known for years. I did a video in January about how the Tories were covering this up. So it's been known about for a long time. This isn't sudden. Just because the mainstream media have started reporting on it, it's not new. I mean, The Guardian, to be fair, were reporting on it at the time. That's how I knew. But they... so we've known about this for a while. Rishi Sunak hasn't been doing anything as far as I can tell. All they've been doing is trying to hide it. And it's like, so why didn't you put some contingencies in place? You knew that this was going to blow up. You knew it was going to become this massive scandal. He hasn't done anything. He could have drawn a line under previous leaders. He could have said, he could have demonstrated how he was going to be different, how he's going to fix things by saying, we've got this problem with school buildings. We haven't paid enough attention to them. I'm going to pay attention to. He could have done that. He could have said to the public, I'm going to demonstrate that I am a details man. And he could have said, this has been left by my predecessors and it shouldn't have been. I'm going to deal with it. At least start. We know he wouldn't have actually dealt, but he could have pretended to start dealing with it. But he didn't. Sunak, I did a video earlier today about the fact he's irritating voters by being upbeat about inflation when ordinary people are going, but I'm actually still cutting back on things because I can't afford things that I could last year. Sunak's going on, oh, inflation's better than last year. Isn't that brilliant? People are going, but I'm struggling more this year than last year to afford things. Because, of course, the way inflation works, as long as it remains high, even if it's not as high, things are still going up. And then, of course, he's had his little meltdown within his own SPAD team this week with his chief of communications quitting after his chief of staff told them all to piss off if they weren't, of a certain mindset. So anyway, Matthew saying Starmer's not guaranteed victory unless he has the backing of Murdoch in 92, who's a somewhat won it. So they said. But, you've got to bear in mind, any outlet like that's going to be a bit self-congratulatory. No, Starmer doesn't need Murdoch's backing. You don't need it. But anyway, let's try and go through some comments. But yeah, well, there's a comment just up there about 92, actually, I just missed earlier. Rob saying, 1992, the year Labour snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. But like I said, it wasn't like that. I've got Harold Wilson up there. It wasn't like that. 1991. It wasn't like now where Labour had this consistent lead. They didn't. And when they did have a lead, like the largest lead they had, very briefly, was +7. I mean, look at this. March the 25th to 27th, it was +2. Then a few days later, it was +7. Then it was back down to +2. This was not Labour on for winning the election. You know, the polling, like lots of people thought it was, and pollsters did make some mistakes. It was known at the time afterwards but these are not, you look at these now, dispassionately, these are not the poll ratings of Labour winning the election. They were the poll ratings at best of it being a tight one. Now, the fact that it wasn't that tight in the end, I mean, I wouldn't say John Major won a huge landslide, but it was a tasty enough majority to be stable. But you know, these poll ratings don't show you that Labour were going to win. You know, I remind you, this on the right hand side, it's Labour lead, so it's only a Labour lead when it's positive. You know, I mean, general election results, it was at -8, but even up to that point, it was +7 was their best. That's not good enough. It's known that Labour need at the bare minimum a +7 poll lead to, you know, just because of the nature of the way seats are distributed. The reason for that, if people aren't aware, is Labour tend to do very well amongst generally more educated and more sort of professional people. So in other words, in the cities. So Labour tend to do well in the cities. And the problem with that is that they tend to win those seats by large margins. But the way to win under first past the post, it's not how many votes you get, it's how many seats you get. So it's winning lots of seats by a small margin. So Labour, because they always win a lot of city seats, not every city seat, but they always win a lot of city seats by large margins. So they always need to have a much higher poll rate in the Conservatives. If they go into an election with a slight lead, that's them behind. That is actually works out at them behind. But anyway, let's catch up with some more comments. Sunak blocked the school rebuilding programme when he was Chancellor, so he had blood on his hands over this. He absolutely does, but you know, irrelevant, even if he hadn't been Chancellor, he was Prime Minister at the point at which the government were handed this report that said this problem is now imminent. I mean, they've sort of known about it for many years. Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister at the point at which he will have been told this problem is now critical. And he will have been told that. If I hear about it in The Guardian in January, he'll have heard about it in like November, December. He was Prime Minister. So he had the option to do something about it. And he could have made a song and dance. Because remember, Boris Johnson in 2019, he didn't try and cover for Theresa May and David Cameron. He threw them under the bus. He said, they have failed you, but I'm different. I won't fail you. Rishi Sunak needs to do the same. It's like he's almost trying to do the same thing, but he just has no idea. And this isn't just greed. It's born of greed. That's why they haven't dealt with these schools, because they want to use the money for themselves or their mates or their paymasters. But it's also incompetent because they have to recognise, if you're going to like strip the country of its assets, you have to recognise some boundaries. You need to conceal the crime, and they're just acting with reckless abandon. How do the poll ratings of 92 compare to 97? Oh, we can show that quite easily. So is it on the same one, or do I have to go into the... Hold on. Here we go. So if we go to 96, so Labour lead, +26, +26, +31, blah, blah, blah. So hefty leads. Let's find the smallest lead in 1996 was +17, and that was significantly below the average, right? So the average is much more in line than now. Now, I will also again point out that you may look at these and think, oh, the average was higher then than it is now. Bear in mind, like I said, votes are split much more widely these days. Back then, you had the Liberal Democrats. The SNP implied, of course, existed, but certainly with the SNP, they get more votes now than they did then. You didn't have UKIP then. I mean, now we don't have UKIP, but it's been superseded by Reform UK. So we've got that extra party in the mix as well that gets several percent of the vote. So in actual fact, what you are seeing from Labour at the moment is much more in line with 96, 97. Much more in line with that. And I'll tell you something else as well. There are lots of other parallels. In 96, 97, the Tories were drowning in sleaze. Right now, it's worse. It's worse. I cannot, like, it's like if you were to describe what's going wrong with Tory Britain now compared to 96, 97, it's quite similar in terms of how you would describe it, but the scale is just off the charts these days. You know, for example, we had NHS winter crises under Thatcher and Major. Well, now we have those crises beginning in autumn. Sometimes last year it was late summer. Now, I've not heard anything specific this year, so maybe it's going to, but it'll not wait till winter. There used to be winter crises. Now they're just like crises, wall to wall, never ending crises. You had, you had a lot of talk about Tory sleaze. These days, it's just off the chart. It's not even sleaze really. It's corruption. There is sleaze there as well, but some of the stuff that Major's ministers were getting up to and destroying the party's reputation over, it's quite tame compared with what the current crop are doing. And of course, Major himself, Major himself wasn't ever implicated in anything like that. I mean, the worst he did was like knob Edwina Curry out of wedlock, but we didn't know about that at the time. That emerged later. Whereas Rishi Sunak is himself mired in the sleaze. Like John Major, at least, like the leader, was, as far as we could tell, as far as we can still tell, sort of behaved himself. It was his ministers who let them all down. But, Sunak's as bad as his ministers. Someone's saying construction workers were exempt from lockdown. Does that mean someone's talking about how because I know Graham was mentioning this, they could have actually used the pandemic because they'll have known about the problems then as well. They could have used that to, start the rebuilding program. That would have been levelling up as well in a way. So that might be what that comment is. I'm just guessing there about construction workers being exempt from lockdown. There were lots of workers something like that where there's lots of, for a lot of the time, lots of ventilation, you're working outdoors in construction. Yeah, that could carry on. Lots of work did carry on. Sue saying, it feels like there'll be more homeschooling. Parents aren't going to want to send their children to potentially dangerous buildings. What about work for the parents? Right? Well, this isn't it. The last time kids had to be like remote learning, a lot of the parents were at home anyway, either furloughed or working from home. That's more. I mean, anyone that was working from home then, the capacity exists now. And, I think employers will, in fact, arguably even the government, I mean, the Tories keep saying, we don't like working from home. They may have to change their tune because it may be the only way to manage it without knackering the economy. Because one of the reasons, it's always noted, for example, when teachers go on strike, it actually does cost the economy because of lots of people having to take days off to look after the kids. So if you've got the capacity to work from home, it makes sense for the government at least to put pressure on employers to say, no, you need to let them work from home. This is an emergency. Because if you don't, then the Conservatives are actually just going to attract more criticism, aren't they? But for people who can't work from home, like retail workers or something, yeah, this is a huge problem. Because people who may have been furloughed in 2020 and early 2021 are not. There's no furlough anymore. So if you have a job there, you have to go and do that job. And this isn't like a teacher's strike. This isn't like for a day or two. This is long term because that building's not safe and that's all there is to it. So until they can arrange for some temporary buildings or try and move some kids to other schools. And the disruption, I'm just thinking about this from the teacher's point of view. I'm imagining if I was still a teacher, I suppose if I was still working in a college, I long ago decided I don't fancy schools anymore. But if I had still been working in a school, this would, whether it was the school, it would almost not matter whether it was the school I was in or not. If there was one local, I, I will just bring this up, by the way. Just a thought occurred. So someone was mentioning, it may have been in the Labour social stream, one of the Labour social streams yesterday, that maybe the Conservatives will blame Labour, try and find, you know, some Labour councils where these schools are and blame them, even though it won't really work, because I think most people realise that local authorities don't actually run schools anymore. But as it happens, that won't work anyway, because I think the worst affected council, even though the government have been a bit quiet about who's affected, I think the worst affected council is supposed to be Essex, and Essex are very, very strong Conservative council. So, yeah, there'll be no party politicking from the point of view of local authorities. The Tories are very much in a glass house on that one. Tories could have fixed the schools, but they never would have, no. Any spending that they think they can get away with. I mean, the way I described it in my video today is they're basically like the Russian oligarchs. Putin thought he was funding a modernized Russian army, modernization of the Russian army. So it was a massive surprise to him when he invaded Ukraine, and then his army was stuck in the mud and tires were bursting and Ukrainian tractors were nicking like armoured personnel carriers and things. And it transpired, of course, that what had happened was the oligarchs had funneled the money that was supposed to be used to invest in the military to their own funds to buy, you know, mansions and super yachts. Then thinking to themselves that they were just doing the bare minimum so that Russia had a show of a military. But as soon as it was going to, and the thing is, beforehand they probably thought they'd get away with it, because up until Ukraine, Russia had only picked on people who would just fall over. This was the first time they actually took on a country with a modern military who didn't just fold like a cheap deck chair. So, and you know, so yeah. But that's what the Tories have done. They've thought to themselves, you know, this building's not collapsing right now, so we won't bother dealing with it, which is incredibly short-sighted. I don't know whether some imagine to themselves that maybe they sort of realise there's a ebb and flow with Labour and the Conservatives. Oh, well, when eventually we'll lose power, then Labour will come in and they can fix it all, and then we can attack them for spending too much money, and then we'll come back to power and they've fixed it for us. You know, I wonder sometimes, do some Conservative MPs see Labour as their maintenance people, the people who come in and fix things? When's the first PMQ? Should be next Wednesday. I can check the House of Commons business. Oh, let me get rid of that because it's very unedifying when that goes up. But I think it's next Wednesday. Let's have a look. Where are we? Yes, Wednesday the 6th of September, next week. Daft question, but aren't these buildings insured? They're not going to be insured for coming to the end of their natural life, no. I mean, I'm not an expert in insurance, but I'm quite sure insurance is supposed to cover like accidental things. It's not supposed to cover the building just ran out of its shelf life, which is what's happened, by the way. These buildings have a life expectancy of 30 years. So when they exceed that, I think your building's insurance on that particular issue is a bit null and void. If a building collapses after a Labour victory in 2024, could that cause damage to Labour? No. Not as long as Labour have made an immediate start on correcting the problem, no, because they will say this was the Tories. As long as they can say, as long as from day one they're on it, because obviously they can't fix them all overnight, but as long as they have a building programme, and if it just happens to be a building that hadn't got its turn yet, then no. Obviously, the longer it is into Labour's term, the more potential there is for damage. If it happens in the first year. Like if they win at some point in 2024 and it happens in 2024, no. In fact, Labour can use it to bash the Tories. It will actually be damaging to the Tories. If it happens in 2025, similar thing. If it happens in 2026, people may, as I say, the longer you go, whether it's reasonable to have expected Labour to replace them or not, the more chance people will have of saying, well, you've been in power for a bit now, so, you know, this can be on you. But in the very short term, no, this will only be damaging to the Tories. Uncle Social saying, Phil, I've tried asking already, has PFI had something to do with this? No. So I know what you mean. So when Labour were last in power, for those who don't know, there were two types of school building programme that occurred. So the stuff at the end, the controversial stuff, was like the school building for future or something. I always forget what it is called exactly, but something like that. That was a PFI. That was like the government would provide so much money if it could be matched by private enterprise. And then lots of schools got new buildings out of it. Those buildings, first of all, they're not 30 years old, but they don't use this concrete thing either. So this is a particular issue with a type of aerated concrete, which stopped being used. In fact, no buildings used this technique when Labour were last in power. So those buildings stopped under like John Major's government, I think. But it certainly didn't go beyond the 90s. So all of these buildings were buildings that were built before. But the other thing is that building schools for the future programme was in the last few years of Labour. Up until that point, their school building was just normal socialist school building. It's like the government just paid. There were buildings in serious disrepair, crumbling, because the Tories had neglected it again. Labour just fixed them. They just used public funds to fix them and rebuild them. So the sort of the PFI school buildings were not for schools or colleges that were basically collapsing. It wasn't for emergency repairs. It was for ones who just wanted a new build. It was the government saying, if you want a new build, if you want a nice modern build, we will basically provide half the money. If you can raise the rest of it, we will provide half. That was essentially what that was. I'm not a fan of it. And some of these so-called modern designs, they might have looked architecturally pleasing, but I have to say as a teacher, some of them weren't all that practical. Particularly as a science teacher, some of them were terrible. Some of I go into some places that have had new builds recently, and the design of the labs is appalling. You know, I went to one, I don't like to name names, but I'm going to. There's one near me in like Doncaster called New College Doncaster. There's lots of new colleges. And then some of them may be fine. But the New College Doncaster, I went into one lab. I would refuse to teach in it. I thought, this is disgraceful. And I don't know whether it was a science teacher that wasn't snippy enough about it. Because I remember the last time I was involved in lab design was when I was working in Scunthorpe at John Leggett College in Scunthorpe. And my lab was being refurbished. And I had a lot of meetings with the architect because what he wanted to do at first, I was like, no. So we ended up getting it designed pretty well in the end. Except I didn't get my blackout blinds. I said I need blackout blinds, and I did not get blackout blinds. But at least the design of the lab was good, which it would not have been if I hadn't have, you know, made myself attend the meetings and put my tuppence in. But anyway, yes, rabbiting on. So none of these buildings are Labour era. Some of them, you know, maybe a previous Labour government, but again, there is no issue. It's not like obviously there is some reason why they no longer use this technique, presumably because more modern construction techniques are better. But I have no issue at all with a building that has a 30-year life, as long as it's understood that there will be a rolling programme of replacing these buildings. As long as governments, when they get into the end of their life, go, right, we need to rebuild this now. then there isn't a problem. I don't have a problem with it. We're not talking about buildings that had some structural defect or where corners were cut or anything like that. There's no suggestion of anything like that. They were just buildings that used a technique that meant that they basically last 30 years. It'll last for 30 years, replace it, don't let it go on beyond that. And the Tories did. They haven't really been building schools. That's ultimately the problem. Adam said, I rewatched a video you did back in January about schools being at risk of collapse. It had a link to a Guardian article where Labour were trying to force the Tories to publish the list of schools. Yes, the Labour have been on at this for a while. Because we've known about this for a while. It's just the Tories will not say which schools they are, and they won't say what they're doing about it because they've obviously not been doing anything about it other than trying to hide it. But again, it's just madness. Imagine if just one child in the country had been killed because of this, and Labour can point out, well, the Tories knew that school was a risk. Because the Tories have got a list of schools that they're not sharing. Could you imagine if one child was killed? Can you imagine? I don't understand. This is where it goes beyond greed and into like baffling incompetence. Because the Tories' reputation is shot. If they kill a child, and they will have killed a child, because not only will this concrete have collapsed because they didn't rebuild the school building when it reached the end of its life, but also they will have concealed the fact that these schools were at risk. They've got the reports and they're concealing it. So this will be the Tories have killed a child. That party is never coming back to power until everyone at the top of the party right now is gone. Any Tory MP who's currently a senior Tory MP, particularly one in Cabinet or in the Department for Education, any Tory MP right now in Cabinet or in the Department for Education, if that happened, whatever ambitions they've got, they can forget about them, because the best thing the Conservative Party can do is get rid of all of them, because they have zero chance of winning power again if any of them implicated in this scandal is there. And this is why I think Labour need to go to town on it, because we don't want a child to die. We don't want a child to die just to screw the Tories. So what we want is for Labour to point out that children have been and continue to be at risk of a mortal threat against their life caused by the Tories, because it's caused by the Tories in two ways. First, they haven't replaced the buildings, and they should have done. It was their job. And second, because given that they haven't done their job, they're concealing the fact. Well, they're not concealing the fact they haven't done their job, because that's evident now. They're concealing where they haven't done that job. And they can cause panic, because it's well reported that the issue is affecting schools that were built using this technique and that are over 30 years old. So as a parent, all you have to do is say, is there any of this aerated concrete in this building? And when was the building built? And actually, if you think about it, because the last of these buildings was built in the 90s, all of them will be over 30 years old, well, or getting there. But a great many of them will be over 30 years old. Wasn't a woman hurt or killed by falling masonry from a dilapidated school? I remember some news to this effect. I'm not sure. But this is the problem, though. Like, first of all, sometimes just things can happen. Things can happen. But what would really finish the Tories off is if a school they have identified as being at risk killed a child. I know it's horrible to say, well, people don't really care about a grown up, which is not necessarily true, but they will. If it's a child, even the Daily Express won't be supporting the Tories. They'll know that it's game over, and that's what I can't understand about Sunak. You know, if a child died in a school, the thing is, and because he's concealing them, let's say something happened in a school that wasn't on the government's list. They actually didn't know about it. They didn't know that school was a risk and it killed them. Because they're concealing which schools are at risk, people will just automatically think that the Tories knew about it as well. So on every level, it's mad. It's mad. What information was released this week that triggered the closing of these schools? the fact that I presume, again, that we're not getting enough information because the Conservatives are not telling us, but I assume that there is actual, people have basically looked at it and gone, yeah, that could come down at any moment. That'll be what's done it. Because basically, you've got 157 schools are not going to be open next week, so we're obviously going to know which they are. But then there's hundreds more, as well as hospitals and courts, we're now told, that potentially have the same issue, but maybe where the government haven't had a report that it's imminent. Nick Gibb, that's the schools minister, by the way, suggested that they got information this week that changed the government's mind to close them. Yeah, they may have had, so they had a report telling them that it was imminent, certainly by the start of this year. What they may now have had is, that problem we said was imminent, there's a crack there now. There's a crack. There's concrete dust falling down. That, I suspect, is what's going on. Why didn't the Tories lose popularity over the Grenfell cladding scandal? Because that wasn't them. That was private companies. Where the government failed was in, first of all, insufficiently tight regulation to make sure that, because basically the people who produced that cladding or used that cladding fiddled the results. So technically it wasn't like the government's fault in a way, other than the government had applied a fairly light touch. Where the government really went wrong is after Grenfell, they didn't robustly chase after the basically criminals. That's where the government are at fault. But the reason why the government didn't lose popularity over that is because it wasn't a public building for which the government were responsible. It was a private building and private contractors who had fiddled results and used poor quality cladding. Why the Tories aren't being hung out to dry for not chasing them is another matter. But they are not, whereas for this, they'd be personally responsible. With UK public services literally crumbling, I don't see how a Labour government cannot afford not to change the tax system apart from wealth tax. Other taxes include inheritance. Is that HT inheritance tax, or is that something else? CGT will be capital gains tax and council tax. So inheritance tax won't be going anywhere under Labour, put it that way. The Tories are promising to get rid of it in their manifesto, I suspect. Labour will not be. That's a nonsense. Well, yeah, I'm in favour of a wealth tax. If, at the end of the day, if they think that it's politically dodgy at the moment, okay, whatever. But, I mean, the bottom line is you're right. Labour, to grow the economy, you've got to build infrastructure. And it's not just that they have to build infrastructure with a poor quality economy. They've got to they've also got to build what the Tories failed to build. And that is going to require money. It absolutely is going to require money. And it's going to require, they are going to have to raise more tax revenues, yes. But when people talk about taxes, when politicians talk about taxes, not raising taxes, what they mean is income tax, national insurance, and VAT. So anything else is basically up for grabs. Even wealth tax, just because they're ruling it out doesn't mean they are ruling it out. We don't know that it'll be ruled out in the manifesto, at which point it's just something like Rachel Reeves can say it now, right? And if it's not in the manifesto, then she can straight away go, oh yeah, that was 2023. Yeah, things are much worse now. We're going to need a wealth tax. Even if she does put it in the manifesto, she can't immediately apply wealth tax because that's too dodgy. But she could after a year or so go, oh yeah, but we've got this situation now. We didn't know about that. So we're going to have to do this. Basically, whatever Labour are ruling in or out, I'm not suggesting that they're lying to people, but whatever they are, what people, and I mentioned this on the stream last night on Labour Social, what people care about is outcomes. Now, Labour are having to, because they say we're going to do this thing, inevitably journalists say, so how are you going to do it? So Labour also have to talk about the process. But voters don't actually care about the process. Labour are just having to announce the process because they've been asked, and they don't want to put voters off. Once they're in power, as long as they deliver the outcomes, voters don't really care about the process. So there will be a lot of political shenanigans going on with regards Labour's like economic policies, as long as they deliver what voters want them to deliver, they'll still win the next election. You know, if Tories go, oh, but you said you do it like this, you do it like this other thing, Labour will just go, yeah, we did it another way. What's up with that? We still did it. The things promised on the wealth tax and related stuff relate to rates. There's plenty of other stuff to adjust because a lot of stuff there is varying degree of exempt. Yes, indeed. Labour, for example, have been quite explicit about some tax breaks to be removed. And that is a relatively rich scene, you know, nobbling a load of exemptions. There are some things that are politically tricky. I mean, particularly since I stopped being a salaried worker and you know, I'm doing this and therefore filling in tax returns every year. I mean, one thing I will say, I keep saying, it's grossly unfair that I pay less national insurance than a salaried worker. And I actually pay a lot less because I pay a bit less than them technically. But if you're a salaried worker, your employer also has a national insurance contribution. Well, there's none of that because I'm not employed. So the government's getting way less national insurance out of me than a salaried worker on the same income. And that's not fair. That being said, I use that as an example of where certain tax breaks are Labour can't remove because it's politically nightmare. Like if Labour do that, they piss. Even David Cameron tried to do that, and there was a huge backlash. So Labour are never going to get away with that. So that'll stay. Basically, self-employed national insurance is lower than employed. Missed my question a few times. Sorry, it does happen. Try pasting it again. As always. Question, I'll do this Tilly first of all up here. So should we expect a big dip in the polls after this scandal? Pure incompetence from the Tories on this. Being honest, I don't know how much lower they can dip. Like, it's not always the case that after a big scandal, the popularity will dip. There's a core of voters who will just always vote Conservative. It doesn't matter how bad things are. They are just convinced that the Tories are the best party. Even if they accept they're very bad, that they are objectively bad, they will believe that Labour are worse. That is the nature of partisan politics. And I think the Tories are pretty close to it. I mean, I know they've had a small... I mean, if you look, again, at this Ipsos Mori one, they're not much higher than the trough with Liz Truss. And in fact, for Ipsos, they've actually been lower. They've been lower under Sunak. So, or have they? Or was that Truss? No, that was Truss. What I'm doing, I'm looking at the wrong one. But, you know, they're still, like, just as I've said that Labour, this is the last 20 years, Labour are the highest they've been, if you ignore Liz Truss, the highest they've been in all of that 20 years. Well, the Tories are also pretty much lower. There was that big dip in 2019 when both Labour and the Conservatives, they were being beaten in the polls by Brexit Party and Lib Dems. If there'd been a general election then, it would have been a very interesting parliament. But aside from that, they're the lowest they've been in all their time. They're the lowest they've been even when Labour were last winning a general election. So there's not much more to lose. I mean, you might expect a bit of a dip, but I don't know that they've got enough to lose from where they are. So M going, would Labour basically have to order the old schools be knocked down, rebuilt from scratch if they're in such a state? Yes, there'll have to be a managed programme. So it may well, obviously schools are comprised of more than one building and parts of building. Usually, I mean, I've been a teacher in places that have had rebuilds, and they don't just level the whole thing and say, right, you go and work in a tent for a few years. So they do it in stages. So they'll try and do the same thing. But Labour are going to, because the Tories, it's hard to even see them starting it because they should have started it at the start of this year. They haven't. So it's really interesting territory for the Tories because This is why Labour really need to focus as well, because actually Labour need the Conservatives to start this programme. They'll get no credit for it because it's happened because they didn't do it early enough. So Sunak will get no credit, but they need to make them to do it. And I'll tell you why. First of all, these buildings need replacing, right? And the sooner that starts, the better. Labour don't want to be left with having to start the process. It should be already underway. Second of all, the Tories are going to have to find the money for it. And it doesn't matter whether it's from borrowing or whether it's you know, well, it has to be from borrowing, let's be honest. They can't find it anywhere else. It knocks their tax cuts into a cocked hat. I mean, they probably can't afford them anyway. But if the Tories are forced into initiating this rebuilding programme, that's it. Forget it. They can't possibly even hint at tax cuts. So Labour really need to. Can Labour get rid of the bizarre non-dom status? That's one of their commitments. That's what's going to go in the manifesto. Yes, they're getting rid of non-dom status. I can't remember the full list. The two most sort of appealing are getting rid of non-dom status and removing tax breaks for private schools. Those are the ones that make it in the news all the time because the Tories are flipping their lids over it. Would this scandal more likely prevent the potentially Tory-leaning don't-know voters from voting Tories? You would hope so. You would certainly hope so in the case of parents or grandparents. Because imagine this, right? Some of you are parents, in fact, of school-age children. Imagine you are now, maybe you had no idea about this before this week. Maybe you had no idea. Now you're turned on to the fact, and you've looked at your school, right? Now, maybe your child is in a school that's had a new build in the last 20, 30 years. In that case, okay, you're probably fine. But let's say you're now thinking, you don't know much about your school, and you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, and you're ringing up the head teacher, and you're going, what sort of school is it? Is this one of the schools that could be affected? Now, the head teacher is also, they're not part of the collusion. The government aren't telling them either. But obviously, the head teacher can easily find out if their school is at risk because, first of all, they'll know how old the school is. They should be able to very easily find out from their own estates department whether it was one of these RAAC buildings. If it was, and it's over 30 years, then you'd have to say to the parent, you know, the government are not giving us the information we're requesting, but it is a school that's over 30 years old and it was built using this technique. So it might be, but we don't know that. Obviously, if the school's been told to close, then they do. In which case, you might be a parent thinking to yourself, so for half a year, my child has been in one of these schools. Because that is guaranteed. If your child is in one of these 157 schools that's not opening next week, then that means the government knew about that school at the start of this year. They knew it was a threat, that there was a threat of collapse, and they allowed that child into that school. So you imagine that as a parent, or imagine that you know if you are a parent that your child was in such a school. Yeah, I don't think you're going to be very happy with the Conservatives because this is your child. You know, they could have killed your child because of greed, neglect, and incompetence. No problem, man. One angry pagan saying the general election debates are going to be hilarious at this rate. Watching the Tories try to defend themselves will be pitiful. But this is what I keep saying. Like, there was a certain time when they kept trying to stick with Boris Johnson, where they kept thinking to themselves, "This will blow over. We've still got time before the election." I mean, at the time they were like 2.5 years before the next election. Oh, it'll blow over. We'll get past it. And I was saying at the time, it will never blow over because first of all, Partygate was never going to blow over itself, but there'll be other issues. Like I kept saying, the Tories have been in power for over 10 years. All their chickens are coming home to roost because this Tory government is way worse than Thatcher's and Major's. I mean, I grew up thinking that there could be nothing worse than a Thatcher government. I entered adulthood thinking, well, there can't be anything worse than a Thatcher government because that was just the environment I grew up in. These are way worse. Way worse. Every single one of them, from David Cameron onwards. and they've actually have got worse as well. And you know, although I say that Rishi Sunak, of the last three prime ministers, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, is the best of them. I mean that from a political point of view, in that he's the most credible. That he, you know, he's the one that the public give him the benefit of the doubt on too many things. But in terms of the way he's running government, it's absolutely disgraceful. I don't know that he's not worse than Johnson in some ways. I mean, Johnson at least he just wasn't interested in running a government. Rishi Sunak's interested in running it in completely the wrong direction. Some people don't want to see the dark side of the Tories. I mentioned Sunak's garden speech in Tunbridge Wells to someone who suggested it might have been A1 and not him. Yeah, it's AI, I think it means, sorry. I read that as A1. It does say A1. I think you mean AI. Yeah, but this is the problem, isn't it, though? It's the problem with, like, I have to admit, I'm partisan. If Labour have had terrible leaders, and do you know what? I've still backed them over the Tories. I've still fundamentally... There's never been a Labour leader that I didn't think was better than the Tory alternative, ever. So I understand it. I don't criticise these people that will just think that even the worst Tory government is better than a Labour government, because that is just their political bias. So I appreciate that. Fortunately, there's only about 20% of voters that are like that. But there we go. Will I be live on election night? I don't think so. I mean, there's not really much point, because what is there to do? I mean, I have said I might do a live stream just after the polls close, because then you get the exit polls. So we can have a bit of a discussion about the exit polls. But after that, I'm not doing a 12-hour stream for the results to come in. It'll be boring. Apart from anything else, I should be going to bed, and I'll wake up in the morning to hopefully a Labour government, like I did in '97. So I may do a live stream. Or there may be a live stream. It may be on the Labour Social or something. I'll just join that. But there may be one where we can at least talk about the exit poll. But I will not be running through the night. Will Sunak avoid the multi-party leaders debate and just attend the head-to-head against Starmer? I don't think he can afford to. I mean, I don't know, because his advice is so poor. Who knows? I like people, again, I keep making this point. People will say, well, Boris Johnson got away with dodging them. It's like, yeah, because he was ahead in the polls. He was ahead. I mean, you could look, because if you look at this last dotted line on the right, where it says general election, that's 2019. The Conservatives were significantly ahead of Labour in the polls in the weeks preceding that, throughout that entire campaign. So Boris Johnson was playing a defensive game, so he could get away with it. The default position was the Tories winning, so he just had to not mess up. Rishi Sunak will begin behind. He will begin behind. And he will probably begin as far behind as he is now. It's hard to see that it will widen much, apart from the fact it hasn't really widened this year. Again, I'm not sure that Labour have a high enough ceiling. I know under Liz Truss it did, but that's because it was so painful. There were people who wouldn't ordinarily vote Labour going, yeah, I'll vote Labour, I'll vote anyone, just get these idiots out. I think Labour are sort of as high, roughly, as they're really capable of. And I think the Tories are probably as low as they're really capable of, all things considered. So I strongly suspect we'll be looking at a fairly stable 20. I suppose if Labour can make a really big deal out of this scandal, maybe they can get a 25-point lead, like a regular 25-point lead, possibly. But the bottom line is Sunak's going to be behind, because everything that's happening, it's like every month the Tories are actually worse off because another chicken has come home to roost. And there's still more to come. Mortgage rates haven't finished going up. The cost of things hasn't finished going up and being noticeable. Energy prices are still not low. They haven't gone down. They should be going down. Why aren't they down now? Back to where they were, average of $1,200 a year. They're not. So it's Yeah, and there's still more problems for them next year. More problems. More problems. At least with Thatcher and Major, they never debased the reputation of the country on the international stage. No, well, Thatcher and Major were like politicians who had principles. I just aggressively disagreed with them, but they had principles. The current lot are not. They're just thieves. That's all they are. They're thieves. They're mob. They're bandits. They're literally Tories in the real sense of the word, which the Irish originally intended for them. They are bandits. That's what they are, vagabonds. I'll be taking next day off and celebrate with booze. Well, it'll be on a Thursday. I might be able to have a quieter Friday, who knows? But there we go. I don't remember them campaigning particularly hard in North Shropshire, though. They seem to be giving Mid Bedfordshire their all. Hang on, who's this? Oh, I'm obviously missing another little conversation there. Labour certainly didn't in North Shropshire. Oh, so we're talking about Mid Bedfordshire, the by-election. Yeah, it's a weird one. I mean, as soon as I looked at it, I thought, well, that's obviously going to be a Lib Dem thing, isn't it? And then you look at it and you think, this is weird. Because if you look at some local election results, there's significant chunks of it that actually are sort of could be Labour voting. If you look at the recent polling, or the more recent I had, which is actually just before the summer recess now, it's not that new. The Tory vote had collapsed. Labour's hadn't really grown very much, but the Lib Dems were like nowhere. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I will not thank either Labour or the Lib Dems if they knock each other out and let the Tories win, because they're both going for it. But I will be fair, at the moment, I don't know who should be going for it, in all honesty. To me, it's not clear. At the moment, Labour are in pole position. But, as people will happily point out in places like this, the Lib Dems often have a higher ceiling. But at the same time, they haven't been converting those voters. The Lib Dems' share of the votes in Mid Bedfordshire, when polls have been done, has not been increased, whereas Labour's has gone up a bit. I don't know. I mean, it's not that crucial. Rutherglen and Hamilton West is a much more important seat for Labour. Tamworth should be coming up as well. So I certainly hope Labour don't knock themselves out for Mid Bedfordshire and not. The priority has to be Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and they will be on the same days because the SNP will move that writ as soon as possible. Sunak will move it to be the same time to split Labour's focus, I think. With conference season approaching after this debacle, will the media start painting Starmer as their king in waiting? No, they most of the media are the Tory media, and they don't want Starmer. They especially don't want Starmer. It's not just because he's a Labour leader, but he's a Labour leader who's got his eyes, although he's not shouting about it, he's got his eyes on media regulation. They don't want that. Right, I'll have to do the last few because sort of run out of time, and someone's vacuuming now. Hope that Labour and the Lib Dems have a behind-the-scenes deal. I mean, they've got a sort of gentleman's agreement not to interfere in each other's target seats, but Mid Bedfordshire, first of all, it's neither of their target seats in the general election. I mean, there's no point. Safe seat for the general election. It will absolutely be won by the Tory candidate next year. But in the here and now, it's not obvious which one of them has the best chance of winning it. And until it becomes obvious, it is sort of fair enough both of them going for it. When Labour win at the next election, I'm going to be as happy as a meat, legless with happiness. Such a happiness hanging over the next morning. See, I suspect I'm actually just going to be relieved, because this is completely different to 1997. 1997, there was this real hope, whereas at the moment, it's almost like the pain will stop, but you also recognise that Labour are going to be really up against it. They have to deliver. They do have to deliver. And there are going to be some easy, quick wins for them. But turning this country around with the economy and the state it's in, because they have to invest to boost the economy. If the economy is doing, like when Tony Blair took over, and Gordon Brown, more specifically, because he was the Chancellor, the economy was all right. I mean, they powered it up. It was still being suppressed. The John Major was not doing well enough with it, but it was all right. There was money to spend. Now there's not going to be. So they're going to have to find the money, but it is really going to be back of the sofa stuff. So I'm just going to be relieved. I think I'm still going to be a bit apprehensive. Am I going to be reading Mad Nad's book? No. I think I'll just read. I'm quite sure other people will, and there will be interesting excerpts produced. I'll read those. I'll let other people do the hard work for me. I don't think I can be asked. I'll tell you what is on my reading list is this. Retained EU Law, a practical guide by the Law Society. So I'm reading a book for lawyers. I say that, I've not actually started it, only arrived today. But that is my reading, and I don't really spend a lot of time reading books these days, but that is what that's going to be. But there we go. Last one then. Will the Tories doubling down on culture wars eventually make the public sick of culture wars? I do hope so. It's like they do work, because it's populism. That's what populism is. It works. But it doesn't work unless you're tying it to the problems that people have. Like, the problems that people have right now is they can't get a doctor. Like, okay, so for example, I had to go to the dentist recently, right? I need a filling, basically. And it took me 3 weeks before I could get the appointment, for the checkup. And 4 months, I get the filling in December. I get the filling in December. 4 months wait. So it was a 3 week wait for the appointment, and then a 4 month wait so I can go in and have my filling, which admittedly is not an emergency thing. It can wait 4 months, but still, that is the step. You know, so when people are stuck in a situation where you can't really get a doctor, you can't get medical care, you can't get attention, and a lot of people who've got serious medical issues, like my partner's eldest, for example, keeps getting fobbed off by doctors because doctors can't cope. They can't cope in the NHS. So they're literally just fobbing people off, and it's only the people who like insist that get any treatment. And you can't afford the cost of living. You're cutting back all the time. People like that, they're not interested in trans rights. They're not. They might have an opinion on it, but they don't want the government to bang on about it, because actually that's not. It's not addressing their concerns at all. Same with Stop the Boats. It's not addressing their concerns. Populism works when you align the snake oil you're trying to sell with the ailments they have, and they're not doing that. But there we go. We are going to have to call it there. Thank you very much for coming on, everyone. We've been a little bit late there. Have a very good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.